Hi, my name is Joe, and I'm going to show you how to replace the rear brake pads on your Nissan Murano. Mine's a 2006. I think the procedure is the same for 2003 as 2007. Before I get started, I'm going to just say the usual standard thing. Whatever you do in your car is at your risk, not my problem, not my fault, but I will try and give you some tips and pointers to help keep you safe. As you can see, I've already got the car up on a jack. I would say you should use a jack and jack stands. That's the safest way to go. And on this car right now, my rear pads are pretty much whipped. They're paper thin. So what we're going to be working on here, I'll walk you through it step by step. Like I said, we've already got the wheel taken off. Here's your caliper. On this car, these caliper guide pins are 14 mils. I'm using a gear wrench today. I kind of partial to those. Tend to make the work go a lot faster. So I'm going to do whatever it takes to loosen this bolt at the top. As I described, I'll be removing the lower one. If you haven't done this on your car, or if it's been a while, you may be using something a little heavier than a regular wrench. You might go to a socket wrench, ratchet, or you might even be using a small breaker bar just to break them loose. After that, also I would not use impacts on these bolts. They're relatively small once you take them out. I'll pull that off and I'll show you what that looks like with the caliper rotated upwards. So the two bolts I was using were a little bit stuck, so I went to an old standby method I was taught a long time ago, which allows you to attach a much larger wrench to your first wrench. Gives you a lot more leverage, again, just to break it loose. And I was able to snap that loose on the upper and the lower. So I should be able now at this point to remove this lower bolt by hand. I can feel there's a little bit of gunk in there already. Now, apparently this bar here that comes down is actually preventing me from pulling it all the way. Okay, so since this bar here was getting in my way with the lower bolt, I opted to snug this back in just hand tight, and I'm going to remove the upper bolt instead, and instead of pivoting up, we're going to pivot down with this. Now the only reason I can even do that is I've had these brakes off a couple of times already, and you'll see, if I can get the focus here, you'll see that I put some caliper lube on there. I'll use a synthetic lube usually. It's made for high heat because of the friction in there, the brakes do experience high heat. So now, with the lower one loose instead and the top one removed, this is actually going to pivot for us down and out of the way. So now this is actually your caliper, the most important part of your caliper here. You've got your caliper piston. These are your mounting points here and here. And if I slide this out, it gives me a little bit more room to play with. And what I'll do is I'll actually clean this up some, lubricate it, and then slide it back in. Now if I were to remove this completely, I would have to remove this bracket as well, based on the position of this bar behind here, because I don't quite have enough room to get that sucker out of there. But that's okay. We can still do a good job cleaning it up. Lubricating these pins here is critical, and it's something that, believe it or not, there's a lot of those shops that don't do them. Your Midas, your Monroe, shops like that probably aren't doing those. Why aren't they doing those? Because they'd rather sell you a whole new caliper and just tell you that it's seized. It's most common for these pins to seize up rather than this. Now this is something a DIY mechanic can do yourself. You can clean this up, you can lubricate it, and even if it's too tight and the lubrication is not doing enough, you can clean this off completely and sand it down just a little, or even file it down just a bit so that it rides back in this tube again the way it's supposed to. I've done that many times. Shaving this down just a little bit, because what you're really shaving down is you're not really even shaving down the metal itself. You're shaving down contaminants, built up grease, rust, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's a tip that not very many people know, but it can save you tons of money. A caliper can run anywhere from $80 to $200, and all you really need to be doing to save them most of the time is keeping these pins clean and greased. Now, as you see, these pins serve double duty. They mount the caliper to the caliper mounting bracket, and then they also slide on these pins. So the way this actually works is your piston will press out, squeeze your pads, and then this is what it rides on. So as it squeezes the pads, these move in, and when they release, they move out a little bit. So these always have to have motion, because what you don't want it to do is you don't want it to be so so tight in there that it squeezes the caliper to the rotor and then sticks and stays there. Because then you're burning up your pads, you're destroying your rotor. It's just not good. So now we'll go on to swapping out the pads. So here you've got the outer pad and the inner pad. And typically these will just pull right out for you. As you can see, these are pretty whipped. There's really not a lot of life left in these. See how thin they are? There's almost no material left. I'm kind of embarrassed to show you this, in fact, because this isn't typically how I usually do my cars. But so that's the outer pad. Inner pad will slide out for me. There we go. It's common to have a little bit of difference in pad wear. You can see this side has a little bit more thickness to it, just a little. A difference like that is not a big deal. Basically, that just makes up and explains the fact that because there's a piston only on one side, the force is going to be a little bit uneven on both sides. At any rate, so that's how to get the pads off. And you can see the rotor there. This rotor, I'm probably not going to do anything with this rotor at this time. I'll leave that up to you guys on whatever your car is. But when I put new pads on this, this is going to start to clean up this edge again for me. I know these rotors aren't very old, so that's what I'm going to rely on in this case. And I'll show you how to put them back on. So right before pressing the pistons for the calipers back in, I take this lid off, but I place it on top to try and keep debris and water or anything else out. Okay, let's talk about the next step of installing the new pads. Our first, at this point, is going to be to get this piston pushed back in this caliper. When you have brand new pads, the face of this piston, or this metal ring here, is flush with this surface right here. I'll show you how to do that. You can either use a C-clamp, a large metal C-clamp if you have one, which I do, but I also like to use this smaller tool that you can get at a lot of the regular parts stores. I'm sure you can get it online. I think I spent maybe about $15 or so for the tool. So your first step here now is to place one of the old pads back in place right in front of the piston. You can see it there. And then what we'll do now is this is what the tool looks like. It's got a sort of a flat spot here that actually presses against that pad. This larger piece will fit on the inner side of this right in here. And then you see the whole thing is threaded with a handle. My handle is partially broken. Gave it a little too much one time. So then this would be how the tool will be placed in. So I'm doing this all one-handed, so it's a little awkward. But pad flat against the piston. And this gets inserted in between. Okay, so as I turn this, you can see the piston is going back in very slowly. Note on this, I like to remove the cap off the top of my brake master cylinder, because what you're really doing is you're pressurizing the lines in a reverse manner. So I like to take the cap off, let that fluid and pressure have a chance to escape. Again, you can use a C-clamp for this if you like. I happen to like this tool. This is what I started using when I first started doing this kind of work for myself. So I kind of hang on to it. I've had this one for a long time. And once the back of the brake pad becomes flush with the front of the piston housing, then it's compressed all the way. And now we'll have room to install the new pads. Okay, so I got the new brake pads here. Now we're on the passenger side. I'm doing the same work on both sides, so now we're working on the passenger side. What you'll find sometimes with these pads is sometimes you'll need to do a little bit of filing on them, or a little sanding, get them to fit good. These ones fit okay on this side. It should just take a nice light pressure, set in one side, slide it in. That way you know that there's a little bit of free movement there. Not a lot. You know, it doesn't need to be sloppy in there. But if you have to really press hard on these, then they're really not a good fit. Now, the back side of this one, I've already checked, and it does need to be ground down just a little bit. So I'm going to go over to the bench and I'm going to show you how we do that. So I've got the brake pad here that was a little bit of a tight fit on the back of that caliper, and I've placed it in the vise very, very gently so I don't crack it or damage it. Normally I would do this by hand. I would hold this in one hand and I'd use my grinder in the other hand, but for the purposes of the video I wanted to have something to hold it. Basically all I have here, I have a regular 4-inch angle grinder. Looks like I'm using an 80 grit disc on there. The grit is not that big a deal. I would go with something relatively hard though, a 60 or 80, maybe 120. But I'll go with something rather hard. Basically the goal here, in this case, is these tend to drag, and this is common for all cars and aftermarket brake pads. I'm going to shave just a little bit here, a little bit here, and a little bit here, because these are the main mounting points where it actually comes in contact with the caliper. So I'm just going to, and we're talking just a little bit here. We're talking, geez, I don't even know. I'm not even sure if a 16th would actually be appropriate, maybe even less than a 16th. Basically, if you look closely enough at this, there's just little imperfections in the way it was cast. In fact, these backing plates are actually stamped on heavy-duty machines out of pieces of steel that are this thick. This piece of steel is probably a good 1/4 inch or 5/16 inch thick. So when these pieces are stamped out, they're just imperfections. So it's not a big deal, but it's common. I find a lot of aftermarket parts like this just need a little bit of shaving on these ears. So I'll do this side, I'll do the other side, and then basically what I'm doing in between is I'm test fitting it to make sure I haven't taken off too much, or maybe I need to take off just a little bit more. And basically we're going for what I showed you a moment ago, where it fits in with a nice light pressure without being forced in. That way you know that the pads aren't going to seize up and sort of hold themselves against the rotor. Okay, so this is one of the caliper slide bolts I showed you earlier. One of the bolts you take out of the caliper mount. I'm just going to clean this up with a paper towel, get some of this excess grease off here that's hardened and gotten some contamination in it. And then I'll add just a touch of fresh grease to it. And there's 2 of these on each caliper, so you got to do this twice. The other one, as I showed you, is partially captured. You can't take it all the way out. So we're going to do our best we can there. We might use a little bit of compressed air, and then also the paper towels. But the key is get the old stuff off, put on some fresh grease, and that way they'll come off as easy as mine did. They came off relatively easily because I've done this a couple of times on this car. I'm going to look at that caliper slide bolt after I've wiped it. Now, as I said, I only wiped it with a paper towel, and then I did grab just a regular red shop rag, nothing fancy. I just stuck my fingernail through the rag into these threads here, spun it to clear out the threads, and then I just wiped down the rest of it. So this is what your caliper slide bolt should look like in good condition before you add more grease to it. Now, some common conditions that you'll run into is if these haven't been serviced before, you'll get a fine rust buildup here, or you'll have like some old grease that's hardened and gotten very dry. So what you'll have to do is hit this with some sandpaper by hand, I would recommend first, until you get to a nice smooth surface like this. You'll know you'll need to do that if even after cleaning these up and greasing them, if they're hard to press back in where they go. If they're hard and they catch, you've got to do something to mitigate that to get this smooth again. And you can take a little bit of diameter off of this, so don't be afraid to sand a little bit if you have to. But the end result with these is these have to be able to smoothly move in and out of the caliper without hanging up at any point. So basically, I'll show you what that looks like a little later, that I can actually move the caliper just a little bit in and out, just with a gentle finger pressure. They should always be sort of free-floating like that. Unless they're being activated and squeezing the brakes, then they should be firm, but just while driving, they should be loose like that. Okay, so what you're looking at is you're looking at this lower bolt that I wasn't able to get all the way out, at least not in this orientation. I could have taken it out completely if I removed the whole bracket. I just really didn't feel like doing that. So what you'll see here, this is the same type of bolt that I just showed you. It goes through the caliper, has this rubber boot here. This rubber boot, when it's properly installed, actually locks onto this ring right here. I've already wiped this off a bit, just with a rag. I got some of the old grease off, and you can move this back and forth somewhat to get better access to the bolt. And I basically just wiped off some of the grease there. So the places you want to get the grease is you want to be able to get a little bit of grease within this tube here. So facing this direction, the way this is pointed. Inside this channel here, you want to get a little bit inside this boot, because that helps protect the pin. And then I like to put a little bit on the shaft here, not a lot, just a little bit of a covering. And then these threads here that go into the caliper, it's always good to have a little bit of grease on them too. As I described, you can get some on the threads, along the shaft here, inside the rubber boot, and then try to get some into this tube here. The upper is similar. This is the rubber boot for the upper. I don't think this one comes off quite as easily. Oh, there it goes. So that's what the boot looks like. So I'm actually going to get some in that tube, again in the boot, just like I described. And that's going to really extend the life of your calipers, and that's going to make sure that that these don't seize up on you. I recommend doing this every time you change your pads, but certainly when you change your rotors. Now I've used some of the same grease on the 3 sides of these ears that I showed you before. And then what I'll do for the back is I'll use a disc brake quiet formula. It makes kind of like a rubbery tackiness on the back of the pad where it meets the caliper, and that helps stop noise. So you do that for all 4 pads, both of those things for all 4 pads. It'll help keep the pads moving freely and keep them quieter. The pad should look like before you reinstall the caliper properly. Just a real thin layer. It looks a lot thicker than it really is. It's basically a paper-thin layer of that disc brake quiet. You can see just a tiny bit of grease on those ears. Now at this point, whatever you do, make sure that you clean off any goop you might have got on the front face of the pad or on the rotor. I hope I'm not insulting your intelligence by telling you that, but make sure you get all the stray grease off. You do not want grease in between the pad and the rotor. And I wanted to show you this. On these brake pads that I purchased, you've got only one feeler. Basically what this feeler does is when the brake pads get low enough, this will actually drag on the rotor a little bit. It'll give you like a really quiet scraping sound. That's when you have to change your pads. When that thing is scraping, it's down so low that you need to change them right away. Otherwise they'll start to destroy the rotors. On this car, Nissan Murano 2006, the feeler actually has to be installed on the back. So as you see, this is the front pad that's already on, and then the feeler would actually interfere right here with the caliper bracket on this front part. So this being installed on the back works just fine, and it fits right in. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that you grease up these pins as well as you do is the caliper should move freely by hand. See that? I can move it with just some basic hand pressure. Also, while reassembling this side, it was very hard for me to get to push this bolt in here because it has that long pin like I just showed you. There was excess grease built up in here. It was clean grease, but because this is such a tight tolerance, I actually had to use a very small screwdriver. Had to leave this down, leave the whole caliper down, and reach inside this cavity and get out the excess grease. And once I cleaned out the excess grease, and I had a light coating of grease on this pin, I could slide it all the way in. Because originally it was pushing out because there's too much grease in here already. It was actually holding this bolt outward, which would have held too much pressure on the pad and on the rotor, would have caused damage. So this, like I said, this should give you should be able to move this, like I just showed you a moment ago. In and out slightly, it should move freely by hand. So for this brake job, I've used this synthetic brake and caliper grease for the pins and for the metal sliding parts on the pads. And then this I used on the back of the pads where they contact the caliper and the caliper bracket. I've had good luck with this stuff. I use this stuff a lot. Since I've used it, I don't believe I've ever had to replace a caliper because of the pins. Okay, so after any brake job that you do where you push those pistons back in like I showed you, after you start the engine, before putting it in gear or trying to drive anywhere, you're going to want to pump this pedal a few times. See how low it goes? That's because we have to pressurize those pistons again so that the pads will meet the rotors. Okay, that took about 4 pumps. And what you'll notice is on the first pump, it was real squishy, real soft, and almost all the way to the floor. But now after the 4th pump, I've actually got good pressure again. So that tells me that the pads have met the rotors. So maybe between 4 and 6 pumps, that way it'll be safe you actually put it in gear and drive the car. If you don't do that, you may find yourself at the end of your driveway not being able to stop. And hopefully you have time to pump that sucker 4 or 5 times before you get in an accident.